Wales is on the brink of the biggest change in the political landscape since the Senedd was created all those years ago, back when it was the National Assembly. And while there has been much talk about the polls, the shifting of party loyalties, and the new faces that we are likely to see within the Senedd chamber, less has yet been said about the relatively dramatic and entirely important changes that have already taken place to the voting system. In May's election, the way people vote, the way representatives are elected, and even how many politicians will sit in the Senedd will look completely different. Supporters say these reforms could make Welsh democracy fairer and more representative. Critics warn they could reshape the political landscape in ways voters may not yet fully understand. Although, as you will hear, I am reassured that awareness campaigns are on the horizon. Today, I am joined by Jess Blair from the Electoral Reform Society Wales to break down the reforms, explain how they'll work in practice, and discuss what they could mean for the future of Welsh democracy. Welcome to Wales in Context, the podcast exploring the stories shaping modern Wales. Each episode, we take a closer look at the politics, policies, and decisions that affect people across the country, breaking down complex issues and placing them in the wider Welsh and global context. From the Senedd to communities on the ground, we speak to the people who know the issues best. I'm your host, Kaiesha Page, and this is Wales in Context. As always, it's best to start at the beginning with the basics. So I started by asking Jess exactly what it is that the Electoral Reform Society does here in Wales. I'm ever conscious of how regularly us politicos, or those within the political sphere, take these kinds of things for granted, never really taking the public along the journey with us. But the mechanics of democracy are incredibly under-discussed outside of the aforementioned political world. And yet, they are the scaffolding of our entire system. It is the legislation that governs these matters that in many ways determine the outcomes of the elections, and it has taken hundreds of years for us to get to where we are. These rules decide who votes, how we vote, when we vote, and so while hidden behind the noise of the actual election, they are vital to keeping our system healthy. So, what is the Electoral Reform Society?
So we are a campaigning organisation that sets out to improve democracy. We have offices in London, Edinburgh and Cardiff, and I also work in Belfast too. We've been going for a really long time, but in Wales not so much, and we've been doing campaigning around Senedd reform, local government reform, extending the franchise to 16 and 17-year-olds, and improving democratic education and deliberative democracy.
Must be really interesting to see the other devolved nations as well, how things are done differently and being able to compare. Is that something that you find beneficial to moving things forward in Wales?
Yeah, it's really fascinating actually. I feel like in Wales, in some ways, we've been like ahead of the game. So, we followed Scotland in introducing vote to 16. We've just seen a bill introduced in Westminster for that, and I'm a bit like, come on, Westminster, catch up with what we're doing in Wales. And then obviously we've had this recent slew of Senedd reforms, and I feel like that's a kind of substantial package of democratic reform that we haven't really seen elsewhere across the UK.
You'll hear the phrase democratic deficit mentioned quite a lot in conversations about political reform and in the confines of this episode, so it's worth briefly defining what that actually means. A democratic deficit refers to a situation where political institutions or decision-making processes are perceived to be less democratic than they should be. In simple terms, it describes a gap between the people and the decisions being made on their behalf. That gap can emerge for several reasons: low voter turnout, electoral systems that produce results that don't closely reflect how people voted, a lack of public understanding about political processes, a lack of political literacy, or institutions that feel distant and inaccessible. The term is often used when discussing representation and trust in politics. If voters feel that their voice doesn't meaningfully influence outcomes or that the system itself is difficult to engage with, then a democratic deficit begins to emerge. With that in mind, I was interested in how Wales compares to the rest of the UK. Devolution has created slightly different democratic systems for the four nations and different circumstances surrounding the political institutions. And it offers us a unique opportunity to compare and contrast how these systems function and who is doing things well and who needs to do more. So I specifically asked Jess how we compare against the other devolved nations in the UK and, of course, England in terms of democratic deficit. So how does Wales compare to, because we obviously mentioned you work in Belfast and with other teams as well, how does democratic engagement or democratic deficit compare to the other nations in the UK here in Wales?
It's a really interesting question. I think probably could do a podcast on that in itself. Yeah. I think it's really difficult to say, and the kind of measurements and the metrics we use to kind of establish that are quite blunt. So the idea of turnout, for example, I've already mentioned, turnout for devolved elections is lower than it is in Scotland. It's lower than it is at UK elections. So that's a really blunt metric, we could say. I would say that there is an obvious thing that is a contributor to democratic deficit in Wales that is worse than other nations, and that is a kind of lack of distinct Welsh media. I know that there are kind of measures to improve that, but a lot of people in Wales will still get their news from UK sources, and UK sources are not very good at reflecting Wales back to people in Wales. So those are the kind of, I think, obvious comparisons across the UK. But as I said, that there are areas where I think we're better in Wales. So the kind of democratic awareness front. So, for example, this year for the first time, the Democracy and Boundary Commission Cymru's Electoral Management Board, there's lots of acronyms in that, DBCC, EMB, will be launching a voter information platform that launched yesterday, actually. So the idea being that it's a centralised voter information platform around these elections and next year's local elections. That hasn't happened anywhere else in the UK. Nowhere else in the UK has a government-funded organisations around democratic education. So I think there are measures to try and compensate, but there are also areas where the reality is that there just isn't that kind of infrastructure in Wales around the media, around democratic education, around proper engagement awareness, and that is leading to major issues around a lack of trust and engagement.
I think it's really glad you mentioned media, because I was actually going to touch on that. Obviously, that's what partly what Talking Wales is trying to do, is try to be that alternative. Our biggest frustration is when we don't hear the phrase in Wales mentioned, or in England, or in Scotland.
I shout in England at my screen quite regularly, yeah.
Yeah, particularly it was about education risk and everything. It was presented as if it was national.
Yeah, doctor strikes, everything like that. In England. Yeah,
that's a really good example, because that's something that we've come up against a lot. We then moved into the main body of our conversation, starting with one of the most seismic changes that was introduced to how we vote here in Wales. And that was, of course, the introduction of votes for 16 and 17-year-olds in 2019. I have always believed that this was a positive change for the country, but in my personal opinion, there was a gaping hole in how this policy was implemented. I wanted to know if Jess, someone with far more experience and knowledge than me, agreed. So I waited to see if she raised this issue in her assessment. Now that we've got the votes for 16, what would you say is the biggest challenge in that?
Well, I think the challenge for engaging 16 and 17-year-olds is probably not that much different from engaging other age groups. You know, we've seen in Wales, particularly with devolved elections, much lower engagement than we'd see at UK elections. And there's a challenge, I think, in reducing the democratic deficit in Wales as a whole. And actually one of the kind of cases, in my view, for 16 and 17-year-olds having the vote was that we could change that. You know, 16 and 17-year-olds are largely in educational settings. They are a captive market to kind of start their democratic journey in a better way. So the idea being that, you know, we could really improve democratic education, make sure that 16, 17-year-olds, when they're having their first vote, are really informed, feel really confident in democracy, and hopefully that will carry on through future generations.
And there it is, education, or the lack thereof it, in my opinion. It's my firm belief that a detailed level of political literacy should have been provided before people reach the age of 16. The second that legislation was passed, that should have been interwoven into the curriculum. A standardised learning plan that would extend across the country, allowing everyone to leave school with a similar basic understanding of what it is they are voting for and how it all works. Unfortunately, while some allowances have been made for this, which Jess is about to touch on, there is yet to be a standard or consistent rollout across the system, with it tending to be relatively patchy and inconsistent. I mentioned to Jess that I had chatted to a few charities at Pride Conference who were offering their own version of democratic training, offering whatever version best suited the users of their services. Would you say that's like a good example of what people are trying to do now with?
Yeah, and I think that's something that we in Wales are way ahead of. So, like, for example, the Welsh Government have their democratic engagement grant. That's something that the Scottish Government are looking at, but they haven't committed any money to, as far as I'm aware, for the next Parliament. So it feels like there is kind of a slew of resources available trying to compensate for the lack of kind of trust and foundations here that you might find elsewhere. But there's also really good networks here. So the Welsh Government run a democratic engagement partnership. We run something called the Democracy Group Cymru, which is available for any organisation interested to join. The purpose of it is really to bring together organisations who are working with either newly enfranchised people or those less likely to be registered. And the idea is really come together, share information, kind of share resources, avoid duplication, and just feel like there's more of a partnership, trying to work together to overcome the kind of barriers that people face to taking part in their democracy.
Take Learning Disabilities Wales, for example, an organisation that is now providing its own version of this training to its users, or the Welsh Refugee Council, who are also doing something unique but with a similar end goal in mind. And while yes, the Democratic Engagement Grant is something, and something is better than nothing, it doesn't alleviate the risk of a spotty and inconsistent approach to political literacy. Because while charities can apply, so too can local authorities. Some have applied presently and some haven't. Interestingly, of the 5 constituencies with lower turnouts in Senedd elections, only the Rhondda has applied. And that was only part of a joint bid with Cardiff Council, and even then, it wasn't for a school programme. This grant scheme is clearly ideal for those targeted campaigns and programmes that are equal in merit to those above. But they would also be better as part of a wider package of programmes for all school-leaving teenagers. The benefits to this are, for me, twofold. Yes, it teaches teenagers how to vote and what they're voting for, but it also captures them before they leave school, potentially making them lifelong voters. But that lack of political literacy makes it harder for democratic changes to be communicated effectively, and so it's left to others and different organisations to attempt to raise awareness. And so at this point in our conversation, myself and Jess moved to talking about that exact topic. What is changing in May's election? So in a nutshell, I know it's difficult to do, but what is changing about Wales that people perhaps I don't think it's been massively communicated effectively. What do they need to know ahead of the election?
Well, I think the communication campaigns are hopefully starting, but it's definitely right to say that there are massive changes coming down the line. So the Senedd is increasing from 60 members to 96. The electoral system is changing, and I won't get too granular on this one. The electoral system is changing from the additional member system, which was 40 first past the post seats and 20 closed list seats, to 96 members all elected via the closed list. There'll be 16 new constituencies with 6 members elected in each. Elections are changing from 5 to 4 years, and now I'll take a breath.
it's all
I said a lot.
Everything seems to be happening just at once. You've got what's going on with the political parties, and you've got all of that. So it just seems like it's exciting election. It's
a massive year of change, I think, and that could be both in terms of like the structure of the election and also the outcome of it too. It feels like, according to polls anyway, that certainly there may be more to play for the political parties.
Yes, it's interesting that it's all happening at the same time. It's brilliant. So why were these decisions taken? What is the kind of end goal with these changes?
Well, there's, I guess, a long history when it comes to Senedd reform. So, the Senedd was established in 1999, very few powers, essentially like an administrative chamber with no primary legislation kind of functions. That's changed massively over the past 26-7 years. We've seen primary legislating powers come to Wales. We've seen more powers for a reserve powers model, tax raising. And I think over this time, there's been conversations that, okay, the Sennedd's not really set up to do this. We first saw the Ritchie Commission in 2004 come up with kind of recommendations around increasing the size of the Senedd. Then when elections were devolved in 2018, we saw the expert panel in 2017 kind of precursing that, saying the Senedd isn't big enough, we need to change the electoral system, all of that. And I feel like all of these changes have really come as a result of conversations that have been going for like 20 years about the Senedd not really being large enough to do the job it needs to do on behalf of people across Wales. For example, 60 members is smaller or the same size as nearly half the local authorities in Wales. It's well under half the size of the Scottish Parliament. It's smaller than Northern Ireland Assembly. And I feel like there is I guess it's come to a crunch point, with members split between multiple committees, not really able to do the job that they're meant to do, that I guess political parties have put their head above the parapet and gone, do you know what, we need to do this, and it's happened.
So in terms of a member of the public who isn't, following this closely, how has it changed for them in terms of when they get to the polling station on the 7th of May? What is it they need to know about how they voted?
So I think there's a real risk there is so much change. It could be really confusing for people. And what I think is helpful is to distill the main message. So the main message is that anyone over the age of 16 who's legally resident in Wales can turn out on May the 7th and cast their votes. What will be different in terms of the actual election on the day for people is instead of the 2 ballot papers you would previously had under the first past the post closed list AMS system, you will have 1 ballot paper that lists political parties with candidates ranked underneath those. And what voters will have to do is just cross a box next to the political party of their choice.
So in some ways it's simplified in terms of the actual public facing element. It's straightforward.
Yeah, I remember the last election in 2021, I was briefing my partner. I was like, there's going to be 2 ballot papers. You're going to have your first past the post choice. You're going to have your list vote. And then we got there. I could hear him going, why are there 3? Because it was PCC elections on the same day. I was like, you haven't briefed me about this. So hopefully the idea, around simplicity is that 1 ballot paper on the day, you just cross your box next to a political party. But that's not to say that just because it's simpler, the voting system has improved.
Obviously, as one of the leading campaign groups in Wales for electoral reform, it was important to ask the Electoral Reform Society via Jess Blair exactly what it is they think of these reforms, whether they are fit for purpose or whether they think that there was potentially a better system. So did the ERS support in Wales the changes that were made?
So we've been campaigning for a long time for the increase in the size of the Senedd. I think we, after the Richard Commission report, were one of the first to do a kind of major analysis of why that was needed in our 2013 report, Size Matters. And we really supported the expert panel's recommendations. I think where maybe the reforms have got lost along the way is through the electoral system that was chosen. So while we're really supportive of the increase in the size of the Senedd, the electoral system chosen feels like it doesn't quite hit the markers it needs. To have a good electoral system, you need proportionality, which this closed list system will hopefully deliver in terms of seats matching votes. But I think the thing that it really falls down on is the kind of lack of accountability. Voters will not have a choice over an individual candidate. They will only be able to pick an independent, either an independent candidate or most likely a political party. And that's where I think this really falls down, this control by a political party. This was always kind of introduced, it felt like, as a kind of compromise between political parties, and it felt like a relatively temporary measure. There's a review mechanism baked in the legislation for post-election. Why go for a temporary system when we could have already kind of taken a step forward and gone for something that permanently worked for Wales?
Yeah. At this point, Jess goes on to tell me exactly which electoral system the Electoral Reform Society Wales would have preferred. And so I want to touch on the differences for anyone who's not come up against these before. Let's start with the one with which many of us are the most familiar. That is, of course, first past the post. It's the simplest voting system and is currently the one used in UK general elections. Under this system, the country is divided into single constituencies, and voters choose one candidate on the ballot, a named candidate. The candidate who receives the most votes wins the seat, even if they do not receive more than 50% of the vote. This means that someone can win the seat even if the majority of voters in the constituency actually voted for different candidates. Supporters argue it is simple and produces clear results, but critics say it can distort representation and leave many votes essentially wasted. Then we have the additional member system, or AMS for short, the one that was used prior to this May's election. This is a mixed voting system that combines constituency representation with proportional representation. It was previously used in Senedd elections. Voters had 2 votes, 2 ballot papers. One was a local constituency named candidate using first past the post, and the second ballot was for a political party which reflected the wider regional area. After constituency seats were decided, additional regional seats were allocated to parties to make the overall result more proportional. Then there is alternative voting, AV, which is another ranked voting system but is not proportional because it still elects only one representative per constituency. Voters rank candidates in order of preference. If no candidate wins more than 50% of first preference votes, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated and their votes are redistributed according to second preferences. The process continues until one candidate has a majority. The system ensures that the winner has a majority of support among voters who express them as a preference, but it does not guarantee proportional representation between parties. Then there is party list proportional representation, a system designed to produce results that closely match the share of the vote that each party receives. Parties present a list of candidates, and voters usually vote for the party rather than the candidate. Seats are then allocated proportionally based on the party's share of the vote. In some countries, voters can influence which candidates are elected from the list, while in others, the order is fixed by the party. This system is widely used across Europe and tends to produce the most proportional outcomes, although critics say it can weaken the connection between the voters and individual representatives. The new system being used in Wales at the next election will be a closed list proportional representation system. Wales will be divided into 16 larger constituencies, each electing 6 members of the Senedd, 96 in total. Voters will choose a party rather than an individual candidate. Each party will publish a ranked list of candidates. Some parties already have published them, and seats will be allocated proportionally based on the D. Hondet formula. We don't need to get into all of that. Candidates will then be elected in the order that they appear on their party list. The reform will also increase the size of the Senedd to that 96 members from 60 of before, with the aim being to create a more proportional system while expanding the current Senedd's capacity. It's worth pointing out here that the increase in Senedd members has been particularly divisive, with many choosing not to support it. The Conservatives have now pledged in their manifesto to reverse this change if elected. And if you listened to our earlier episode where we interviewed Samuel Kurtz, MS, you'll have heard his argument against this change. It is also worth adding another voice to this part of the podcast, because a couple of weeks ago, Laura Butler was given the opportunity to chat with Professor Laura McAllister, an individual who has been very outspoken about the new system. Here is her voice from that interview with Laura.
There's a real irony as well with closed list PR in this particular election because we have such a competitive party environment with multi-parties competing for votes. There's the irony that this could prove to be one of the most disproportional elections that we've ever had under devolution. And the irony comes from the fact that all the changes we've brought in were meant to make this system fairer in translating votes cast into seats won. If that doesn't happen, then it's fair to ask the question about the validity of the choice of closed list PR.
The aim was to balance local representation with fairer overall outcomes, although the results were not always perfectly proportional. Then there is single transferable vote, or STV for short. This is a proportional system where voters rank candidates in order of preference, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Each constituency or region elects multiple representatives rather than just one. A vote quota is calculated, and candidates who reach that quota are elected. If a candidate receives more votes than needed, their surplus votes are transferred according to the voter's next preferences. If no one reaches their quota, the lowest performing candidate is eliminated and their votes are redistributed. This process continues until all seats are filled. The system gives voters more choice between candidates and tends to produce proportional results, but the counting process can be more complex. This was actually the Electoral Reform Society Wales' preferred option, but it fell at the final hurdle.
So our preference would be STV. That is a system used in Northern Ireland. Scotland uses it for local elections. It's pretty well established. I mean, political parties use it themselves for selecting. And I think that was something that was recommended by the expert panel. It was re-endorsed by a couple of Senedd committees, and that fell at the hurdle of political party negotiations. So this has all come about as a result of a deal between Labour and Plaid Cymru. Plaid Cymru always really been supporters of STV. STV did not get through Labour Party internal discussions, and that's how we ended up with this closed list system that ultimately I think will be quite difficult for Labour to do quite well under. It's almost like, you know, they've kind of shot themselves in the foot with it, which I don't think anyone saw coming a few years ago when this was taking place.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'd love to know if they do actually regret that decision now. And So moving forward to kind of the last two questions, what would you be campaigning for now? Whoever is in office in May, what are the next stages that you would like to see in terms of the broader democratic deficit picture?
Well, I've already mentioned that review mechanism baked into the legislation. I think the aim when that was written in was that closed lists would be a kind of temporary measure, as I said, and then longer term, it may be for the next Senedd to review a kind of long-term permanent electoral system. That's obviously not ideal. You know, democracy is something that we should kind of keep a constant check over. It's something that we should be looking at a lot. But for voters, there are risks in changing electoral systems all the time. And I think it's ultimately something that political parties who push this system through, knowing it might not work long term, should really regret. So that review mechanism, I think, will be really important. It's obviously going to depend on the makeup of the next Senedd and the kind of wants and whims of governments and backbenchers, because any changes will require a 2/5 majority. But what we have been good at in Wales, I think, is a kind of process around democracy. You know, I talked about these changes all kind of coming from a longer term conversation. We've had expert panels, we've had Senedd committees looking at this. I feel like this might be the next step in that story. This is a real process, not an event, to paraphrase really poorly Ron Davis. There's a process around democracy, and we always need to kind of nurture it. It's like a garden. We need to kind of look after it and nurture it and make it successfully bloom. And hopefully that will continue post-election.
That's brilliant. And so just looking ahead to May, do we have any kind of feeling at the moment about how turnout might be looking? Because it feels as if it's quite an exciting election for a lot of different reasons. But for us in the political sphere, obviously we're looking at it from the electoral reform aspect and thinking it's exciting to see how that unfolds. Yeah. Do we have any kind of information at the moment on how turnout might be looking this time around?
It's really difficult to say. You know, we're a few months out still from the election, and turnout's a really blunt tool. I would hope that it would improve this time around. I think there are more stakes maybe at play in this election. And we saw with the Caerphilly by-election that turnout was relatively high for a devolved election, although still really not where we'd like it to be. So I would hope that it would improve. My kind of concern would be that it's not improving because people are more engaged or more aware of this unnecessarily. It's more that there are stakes at play, or that they are voting against or for a particular perspective. So I don't necessarily think an increased turnout suggests a healthier democracy, so to speak. But it's certainly something that we would like to see more people being engaged, particularly newly enfranchised voters. You know, the idea with 16 and 17-year-olds being enfranchised in Wales has always been a kind of, this will be a process. There's no quick hit like there was in the Scottish referendum for Scottish young people. This is something that over time more 16 and 17-year-olds, more foreign nationals are going to be engaged with, and hopefully we will see that start to develop at this election.
One final question I've just thought of. What would be your message to someone who's on the fence about whether they should vote this time around, and why is it that potentially their vote would count even more with this new system?
So as much as I've kind of battered the system a little bit, this system is a proportional system. So if you turn out to vote in this election, your vote will count. And I think one of the things that others maybe aren't flagging as much with this system is there are 6 seats in a constituency. Those 5th and 6th seats are going to go down to a couple of votes, honestly. Like it could not be tighter. Some of these will be a coin toss. Your vote will impact. And, you know, ultimately, I think people should have a say on major issues that affect their future. This election will decide on the next Welsh Government, who will make policies and laws around education, health, the economy, things that really matter in this country.
So as we've heard today, the changes coming to Welsh elections are not simply a minor tweak to the rules. They represent a fundamental redesign of how democracy works here in Wales. From the expansion of the Senedd to 96 members, to the shift away from the additional member system and towards a fully proportional party list system, the mechanics of how representatives are chosen are being reshaped in a way we haven't seen during the days of devolution. Supporters argue that these reforms could create a more proportional parliament, one that more accurately reflects how people actually vote across Wales. Critics, meanwhile, raise concerns about the power placed in party lists and whether voters will feel a weaker connection to their individual representatives. Either way, the reality is that the political landscape in Wales is about to change, potentially dramatically, and not just in terms of which parties may gain or lose seats, but in how those seats are chosen in the first place. The mechanics of democracy are often hidden behind the scenes of the election, the campaigns, the debates, the personalities, but the rules themselves shape the outcome long before a single vote is even counted. Understanding the basics of how those work is essential to understanding democracy. I want to end by thanking Jess Blair from the Electoral Reform Society for helping to unpack what can often feel like a complicated subject, and for bringing some much needed clarity to what is a significant moment in Welsh democracy. Jess is brilliant at what she does, and I'm so grateful we were able to get her on this podcast. You have been listening to Wales in Context. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow the podcast and share it with someone interested in the future of Wales. All notes and resources from today's episode can be found in the show notes. You could also follow Wales in Context on TikTok, and if you'd like to support the podcast, please consider leaving a comment or a review. Thank you for listening. Diolch.